Hello, 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 and welcome to this edition of the Jolly Heretic. I have such a special guest for you today. A number of you, a large minority of you, shall we say, have been extremely enthusiastic about me getting this learned gentleman on the show, and I'm fascinated by it in a way because from what I can work out, there is a great deal on which I disagree with this person on. I disagree with him about evolution. I disagree with him about intelligence tests. I disagree with him about many, many things. But perhaps we agree on something fundamental. I don't know. But that person is Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Jones, hello.
Hello. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. How is life treating you at the moment?
It's better than I deserve.
Better than you deserve, really? Okay, all right. So we already had one pre-registered super chat from a chap by the name of John Oliver Rayner Hills, Esquire, and what he wants to know about is the concept of G-non, that is, nature or nurtures God. Are you familiar with this?
Nature's God, yes.
Nature or nurtures God. And it's the idea that basically that those of us who are like myself, we're an evolutionary psychologist. I'm interested in evolutionary theory, and what we tend to find is that the ideas that are promoted by traditional religion as being the will of God are also the sort of evolutionarily adaptive ideas as well. And so if groups don't adopt those ways of doing things, they ultimately are maladaptive and they get selected against and they die out. And so the essence of the argument is that neo-reactionaries or traditionalists, or whatever the appropriate term is, and evolutionary psychologists are kind of have a common viewpoint on these areas. And if you disagree with both Darwin and with St. Thomas Aquinas, then you're very, very wrong indeed. That is the essence, it seems, of G-non. What's your view on that area?
I think the best way to enter this would be through Adam Smith. Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand. The invisible hand has a long history, but the history, if you delve into it, they find that the hand is invariably attached to God. And in a sense, the only way this hand makes sense is if it's attached to God. And so what you have in Smith is a contradiction of the sort that I would call typically English. Typically English. This is typically English. I know he's Scottish, but he studied at Oxford, so that's where he picked up this idea. But basically, you have with Smith is a man who took over Newtonian physics and applied it to economics. So Newtonian physics, Sir Isaac Newton created a universe in which you had gravity and inertia creating perfect circular motion, which then, in a sense, obviated the need for God. God didn't have to intervene. God created the whole thing at the beginning. God didn't intervene at all. You had these two forces that would create motion, and that's the way the universe ran, and that was it. And so as a result, you had basically God banned from the universe. That's the way everyone took it. Now, Smith comes along, and he applies these two terms to economics. So instead of gravity, you have self-interest, and instead of inertia, you have competition. But it's the same thing. You've got this system where everything functions according to this mechanistic dialectic, and you don't need God. Well, it turns out you do need God. Smith needs God, because the question is, if everyone follows his self-interest, won't things get bad? And the answer is, of course, yes, because self-interest is another word for selfishness. So what he's trying to say is that no, it won't, because we have competition, but ultimately, and here he has to invoke God. He says the invisible hand will come in and smooth everything out. The invisible hand is his way of talking about divine providence. Divine providence runs the universe. This is the only thing that will make sense out of what he's saying, because he's drawing on a history of Christian thought that goes all the way back to the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. Joseph, you'll remember, was thrown into a cistern by his brothers. They were going to kill him. They sold him into slavery instead. He was sent to Egypt. And there he rose to a very high position under the Pharaoh. And then there was a famine in Israel, and his brothers had to come to Egypt. And he said to them, the evil, after he forgave them, he said, the evil that you intended to do to me has been turned by God's power into good. That's divine providence. That is God's role in human history. God has not abandoned the universe. God is intimately involved in every aspect of the universe. And we know that because the main problem here, when you say something like that, is evil. And here is a position in the Bible, a statement in the Bible, which basically explains the existence of evil. Of course, evil exists in the world. Everybody knows that. But how do you square evil with divine providence? Well, God intervenes and he turns evil into good.
We're moving away. We're moving away.
Just to get back to what I'm saying here, this is what Adam Smith tried to do with the invisible hand. It was a truncated Englishman's version of divine providence. And the only reason it made sense to the people of the time is because he had that residual sense of divine providence there.
He had a sense. Let's get back to that, though, because that's perhaps the important point. You talk about a sense of divine providence, and it strikes me that one of the issues with a lot of academics of researchers in this period, Charles Darwin is an example of this, is that they were deeply religious people. And because they were deeply religious people, they saw the world as you say, divine providence, as it were, as God's creation, as God's revelation. And they saw their purpose as understanding the nature of God's revelation. And they felt that God is truth. God is the word of God is truth. And that truth was this fundamental. Truth was something external to them, which was validated by God as being true. And like a Platonic world of forms. And so consequently, once this belief in God, this idea of divine providence, or whatever you want to call it, is taken away, then there ceases to necessarily be a strong incentive for scientists to tell the truth. And we've got to a point now where people like Daniel Dennett at Tufts University openly argue that if something is empirically true, but the statement of that empirical truth will have what they see as bad consequences, then it is the scientist's duty to suppress that truth. And I wonder if that's the point of commonality between the evolutionary psychologists and the traditionalists or whatever, that you have this fundamental belief in truth. What do you think about that?
Truth is the adequatio rei et intellectum. It is the correspondence between thought and the mind. Okay? I'm sorry, the thing and the mind. The thing and the mind. So truth is psychological. So let's take a step back from that and talk about logos instead. Okay? Right. What is logos? Logos is the order of the universe completely independent of any psychological quality, any type of verification of the mind. Okay, this is the starting point of the investigation into the universe that began with the Greeks. Actually, it's not the starting point. The Greeks understood that there was some type of order to the universe. They tried to come up with some type of fundamental principle. And Thales said it was water, and Anaxagoras said it was air, and Heraclitus said it was fire. And then suddenly Heraclitus started talking about logos or mind. I'm terribly sorry. When you say that the truth is psychological, what do you mean by that? Do you mean it's subjective? It is apprehended by the mind. It's not subjective, but it's an apprehension of the mind. So you're saying that there's such a thing as objective truth? Yes, if it's true, it's objective.
So is it your view?
So if I say to you, look, I'm making noises with my mouth. Okay, if I were talking in Finnish, you wouldn't have a clue about what I was talking about. So if I said in Finnish, there's a gun on the table behind you, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about.
Well, I would.
So I'll say it in English. Then some other language. Okay, if I say in English, there's a gun on the table behind you, you turn around, you look at the table, either the gun is there or it's not, the statement is true or false. That's truth. It's a correspondence between a statement of the mind coming through language and a reality actually existing.
So is your view that there needs to be a God, or else there can be no truth?
That's too far down the food chain. Okay, I'm saying there needs to be, there cannot be logos without a God.
Well, I'm not particularly clear on what logos is. Independent of theology, how would you reduce logos to a concept that a scientist could understand what
Reason.
you mean?
Reason.
It means reason.
Yeah, order. It means speech. It means word. It means order. It means the order of the universe. All of these things are dependent upon a God, because there cannot be order without someone, a being, creating that order. This is the fundamental distinction between what I believe and what the Darwinists believe. Okay,
well, I mean,
the Darwinists believe that an order can come out of chaos. I am saying that that's impossible.
What you're advocating is a form of the teleological argument, right? One of Aquinas.
I believe in the teleological argument, but it's not an argument that I'm making from I'm not making a teleological argument. I'm saying that there is a fundamental order to the universe that was put there by some being that you would have to call God.
Okay, and the counter argument to that is that for a universe to be ordered, it has to appear ordered. So you could have a universe that you could conceive of a situation where there was no God or where there was a God, but either way, the universe would have to be ordered, or it wouldn't be a universe.
That's right. Yes,
right.
It has to have order.
It doesn't necessarily.
The mind apprehends order. The mind apprehends order. So the question is, well, where does this order come from? How is order possible? How is order possible? Now, you mentioned Daniel Dennett. And Daniel Dennett he's one of the four atheists, the four horsemen of the new atheism that appeared about 10 years ago. Daniel Dennett is the only one of these four people who is a philosopher. And he has the distinction of having made one of the dumbest statements in the history of philosophy. And the statement is, the universe created itself out of nothing or something very small. That has got to be one of the dumbest statements ever made in the history of philosophy. Okay? Now, first of all, let's eliminate the second part where he's hedging his bets. Okay? Because if it's something very small, it still exists, and therefore it's still the universe. Okay? But let's go back from there. The universe created itself out of nothing. That is impossible. That is logically impossible, because it means that the universe would have to exist before it existed. That's impossible.
But that's the kind of more of a cosmological argument. The counter argument to that was presented by David Hume was just what caused God then? Where does God come from? Why stop there?
Because David Hume did not understand that there is a distinction between the creator and creation. There's a fundamental distinction here. And God is the creator, and he created creation. You cannot have a creator for the creator.
Right, but you're assuming but that is a circular argument, because you're assuming that the universe has been created.
The universe has been created. That's right.
You haven't demonstrated. But we're moving away from what interests me more, if I can pursue you on it, which is this idea. I'm trying to work out, and that's what one of our super chatters asked us about, why it is that I saw you, for example, on Mark Collett's show. And you were saying you don't agree with IQ tests, you don't agree with Darwinian evolution, you think that that most of Western civilization ultimately comes out of the Catholic Church, and various other things which he disagreed with you on.
Right.
And what I would also tend to disagree with you on. But what particularly fascinates me is that there's a portion of people who concur with me on a lot of my perspectives, but who also are big fans of yours. And what that question was trying to get at is the relationship between, I suppose we could call you a traditionalist philosopher or a traditionalist theologian or something like that, and evolutionary psychologists, about people like myself that try to understand the evolution of the human mind. And what's interesting about traditional religion is it tends to take the things which we are finding are adaptive forms of behavior. Forms of behavior which mean that if you or your group do those things, you are more likely to pass on your genes. Those forms of behavior, those are what are promoted by traditional religiosity as being the will of God. So religion seems to be taking adaptive forms of behavior and saying, these are the will of a mega being, and consequently you should definitely do them, and thus you're more likely to do them. And so it follows that the more religious group is more adaptive. And we've got lots of evidence that's the case. Being religious is adaptive in evolutionary terms. It means you have higher fertility. It means you have better mental health. You have better physical health. You live longer. You have your genetics in general seems to be better. It seems that's what's going on. That's where these two come along. That's where these two cross over. And what the chatter was asking for was your view specifically on that nexus. What do you think about that?
Yes.
You think, yeah.
Yes, there is I would say back to the Logos. Okay, there is a God who created us according to a particular plan. Okay, success in life means operating according to that plan. Now, if you want to call that adaptive behavior, you can call it that, but I mean, that's the way I would see it. In other words, if you want a successful life, there's an essence to what you have, and your behavior can either conform to that essence, in which case you will be happy, or it will contradict that essence, in which case you will be unhappy.
I see. Yes, and there is actually evidence that religious people are happier, and it's not simply. I mean, it's true that if you go to church regularly, then you do tend to be happier. It does elevate mood, but equally, religiousness is 40% genetic, and people who are religious carry forms of a gene which mean they are less likely to become unhappy in adverse circumstances. And so, the way I see it is, we've been selected over a long time to be religious. To be religious is the evolutionary norm, and consequently that goes with other evolutionary norms as well, such as not suffering from depression, and so on. I did a paper on it called "The Mutant Says in His Heart There Is No God." These people that don't believe in God are genetic mutants who are rising up as a consequence of weakened selection. All right, good. I hope that's answered the question for John Oliver Rayner Hill. So I want to move on to the next question, which was, oh God, we've got loads of them. Talk about Shlomo Sand and the origins of the Ashkenazis. I'm afraid you're going to have to walk me through this, Dr. Jones, because I don't know anything about it. So what is this Shlomo Sand?
Well, actually, I think the Shlomo Sand wrote a book analyzing the founding document of the State of Israel, and one of the tenets there is that the Ashkenazi are descendants of Moses. This is not true. The Genome Project has established that the Ashkenazi people are Turkic, a race that is Turkic in origin, coming from the north shore of the Black Sea. Arthur Kessler wrote a book called The 13th Tribe, which basically said that the Khazars in the 18th century held a kind of contest between the three main religions at that time, and they liked the Jewish version, so they all converted to Judaism. So the fundamental point here is that the Ashkenazi have no biological relationship with the religion of Moses. They're not Semites. They're Turks. So that kind of undermines the racial basis of the State of Israel. I think that's the whole point of Shlomo Sand's book.
Right, but I mean, as I understand it, genetically they do have a great deal in the way of Semitic genes,
no,
do they not?
That's not my understanding. No, that is not my understanding. That is not my understanding of the Genome Project.
So is the idea that there are Turkic people that at some point adopted Judaism, like the Ethiopians adopted Judaism?
Right, just the way the Europeans adopted Christianity, this group of people adopted Judaism. They were converts. The Ashkenazi were converts.
I see. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I have to, but only the Ashkenazi, not the Midrahim or the
Sephardic Jews are from Spain, I don't know. I don't know I don't know whether that's the case with them or not, whether they have Semitic DNA or not.
I know from Richard Lynn's summary of the research that they do have a significant amount of white ancestry, modern day Jews. There's been a lot of intermarriage. So this idea that it's all matrilineal and so forth is a bit of a myth, really. But okay, that's very interesting. So I hope that answers the question to the super chatter who, that is to say, T. Torchin, $2. Thank you, sir. Okay, we have another question from Liam Foley, €10. Thank you very much, so very kind of you. Can Dr. Jones persuade Dr. Dutton to cross the Tiber to the pre-1965 Nostra Aetate Dignitas Humanae Church, as Englishman J.H. Cardinal Newman, enemy of the anti-logos liberalism, is raised to the altars? So I believe they're asking me, can you persuade me to become Catholic or traditional Catholic? I believe that's the
well, apparently he thinks if I give you the traditional teaching of the church on the Jews, you will become Catholic.
Okay, well, then you tell me, what is that teaching then?
The traditional teaching on the Jews is known as Sicut Judaeus Non, which began right. The phrase first got used right around the fall of the Roman Empire. The next 200 years, the church had to take up the governance of Europe because the governance had collapsed of the Roman Empire. So, one of the first problems they had to deal with was the problem of the Jews. We're not living in a place that believed in the separation of church and state. So you have an alien group living in your culture, not only an alien group, but the alien group that killed Christ. And so therefore is antithetical and inimical to everything you believe. How are we going to deal with this group? And the answer was Sicut Judaeus Non, which is basically a two-part program. On the one hand, no one has the right to harm the Jew. No one has a right to desecrate the cemeteries. No one has a right to disturb his religious services. On the other hand, the Jew has to behave himself because we are allowing him into this country as an alien, resident alien. And that means the Jew cannot work for the corruption of the morals of the local population, the Christian population, nor can the Jew ridicule the faith of the Christian population. So it's a balanced thing, and that, I think, was a successful modus vivendi for about 1,500 years. That's what he's talking about. So now you can convert. Now that you know this, you can convert to Catholicism.
So the idea is then that the foreigner among you, the organized foreigner among you, has to be kept in control in some way. Otherwise, his ethnic interests will cause him to undermine the unity of the group among which he has come.
Yeah, I think that the church recognized that they have this penchant to subversion. We have it to this day. People always call me an anti-Semite when I bring this thing up, but basically, the Jews were behind gay marriage. If I say that, people call me an anti-Semite. Amy Dean said it in Tikkun magazine. She brags about it. You can say one thing after another. I say the Jews are behind pornography. I'm called an anti-Semite. Professor Abrams in the Jewish Quarterly, in an English magazine, he writes the same thing, takes my article, writes the same thing, and says, but it's good. It's good that we have pornography. And he's praised for making exactly the same thing. There is this Jewish penchant to subversion, which I trace to their rebellion against Logos. And this is in my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit.
I see.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it would make sense in the sense that my own research has indicated that Jews are particularly high in positive and negative ethnocentrism compared to European people. And people tend to act in their genetic interests. It's called genetic similarity theory. They tend to be friends with people that are more genetically similar to them than could be the case by chance. They tend to marry people who are more genetically similar to them than could be the case by chance. They act to elevate their genetic interests. And one of the ways you can do this is by acting in the interests of your extended phenotype, i.e. your ethnic group. And so it makes sense that, for example, white people in Zimbabwe would vote for the Movement for Democratic Change rather than for the nationalists, for ZANU-PF, because it's in their ethnic interest as white people for Zimbabwe not to be highly nationalistic. And equally, it follows that it is in the ethnic genetic interests of Jews for Europeans not to be highly ethnocentric. And it would follow from that you would want to critique their traditions and the things that hold them together and make them ethnocentric. This is what Kevin MacDonald argues.
Yeah.
And you put this down to the rebellion against Christ or whatever, but in theological terms. But I suppose you could equally see the rebellion against Christ as a failure to conform to what the majority were doing. So that's again another example of this what we were asked about in the first question, of these two things kind of coming together, these two ways of thinking leading us to similar results.
I think you're coming up with a sociological explanation. I'm coming up with a more theological explanation of the position of the Jews, because I think that politically it's impossible to describe them accurately. You had to go to categories higher than politics, because the Jews will never explain their identity to you. It becomes a shell game where at some point it's ethnic, but then another point it's religious, and we go back and forth, and they use it constantly as a weapon, basically, against the majority population. So we've reached a point now where any description of the Jew as a group will be considered anti-Semitic if the statement is negative or made by a goy. So, for example, I got into a big discussion with Dr. Brown, and I tried to explain the historical origin of the word anti-Semitism, which was a racial term created by Wilhelm Marr, who didn't want to use theological terms because he was a revolutionary. He'd been in the Revolution of 1848. And he just dismissed that. No, that's not it. Well, wait a minute. Yes, that is it. That is, you have to come up with some type of refutation of what I said. You can't just dismiss this, but this is what he does. And no. Any use of the term in a global sense is anti-Semitic. Well, I said, well, wait a minute. You did a documentary in which you said Jews were intelligent. Isn't that a global use of the term? So what you see here is just a colossal double standard. In other words, if the Jew is saying something positive about the Jews, well, of course they're a group. If the goy says something negative, well, you're being anti-Semitic because you're lumping them all together. Well, you can't have it both ways. We're tired of these games. We're tired of the double standard. We're tired of the weaponization of this type of discourse.
Okay. The Kaiser, $4.99, thank you, sir, says, Dr. Jones, what are your opinions on Rodney Stark? Also, why is it preposterous to assume that God created race differences in intelligence?
I don't know who Rodney Stark is.
Rodney Stark is a sociologist of religion. So Dr. Jones has no opinion on Rodney Stark. He assumes that you believe it is preposterous that God would have created race differences in intelligence. What do you think about that?
Race? Is it preposterous to say
race differences in intelligence? Do you think it's a preposterous idea, and if so, why?
Race difference in intelligence was created in America at the beginning of the 20th century. Stanford, Binet, these type of standardized tests, in order to exclude certain groups of people from the United States of America. It was based on immigration. It was based on.
It doesn't mean that those differences don't exist.
Pardon me?
The fact that an IQ test was invented in 1912, and the fact that there was a motive for wanting to deploy it, does not mean that there are not differences in intelligence between different.
Yeah, I've never been convinced that the IQ test was an accurate indication of intelligence.
But it correlates.
What you see here is, over a period of time, the test becomes synonymous with intelligence.
Well, no.
For example, you get. Let's get the SAT test, for example.
Yes.
The proof that you're smart is that you have high SAT scores.
No.
This has no correlation.
That's not accurate. First of all, the SAT test is not an IQ test. It correlates with IQ at 0.7. Secondly, the measure of a successful instrument is if it correlates in the expected direction with other intuitive examples of what it is you're trying to measure. So if we're trying to measure weight, the evidence that a weighing scales is a good scales is if the results that it gives you correlates with getting a load of people and getting them to lift people up and estimating who weighs more than who. And if it correlates in the expected, that's a good weighing scales.
I understand that. I
Right. So
understand.
if IQ test correlates with other measures that we understand as measures of cognitive ability, like
Like what?
educational attainment, then it's a good IQ. Then it's a good measure, and it does. It correlates at 0.7 with educational attainment.
But educational attainment is a function of the test.
No,
You're,
it's not.
you're
It's not.
constantly
No, no, no,
talking.
no, 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 no.
You're constantly talking about circular arguments here.
No, no. Let me explain. No, let me explain. IQ correlates with how good you do at like Latin, how good you are at writing poetry, how good you are at maths, how good you are at even pitch discrimination, how good you are at music, how good you are at all academic subjects you can think of to varying degrees. IQ predicts that. So it's not a function of the test. It's a test, and the test correlates with these other things.
I just don't see it.
Well,
I don't see it in life. I mean, all I can tell you is that, in a sense, the instrument becomes a circular type of instrument. And this is most apparent in the SAT test. Do you think the SAT test is an accurate judge of intelligence?
Yes, the SAT test correlates.
The SAT was much more important because this was what allowed you to get into the elite schools.
But the reason why the elite schools took the test seriously is because the SAT test correlates with IQ at 0.7, so it's 70% measuring the same thing. And they found that people that do better on the SAT test do better on other measures of cognitive ability, such as essays and whatever.
I just don't.
The IQ test correlates with health.
I'm sorry.
How healthy you are. It correlates with how long you live. It correlates with whether you're a criminal or not.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but this is not the case.
It is the case.
This is not the case because if you look historically at the judgment of the creation of the test, it was meant to replace things like real world abilities.
Yes,
like writing.
That was the brilliance of it, because real world ability is a complex and more subjective thing, and so if you can test it in that way. I mean, it's like, but how are you going to measure blood pressure? Are you going to measure blood pressure by putting your fingers on your pulse, or can you measure it with a machine? The machine is not that reliable, but the machine is more reliable than doing it manually. So it was simply an attempt to quantify intelligence in the same way that you can try to quantify personality.
Let me give you an example here. You can become a doctor, a medical doctor. Okay, and in order to become a medical doctor, you have to take enormous numbers of tests. You have to take many more tests than you have to take when you're just going to college. Okay, now, one of the problems you can develop as a human being is appendicitis. Okay, how does the doctor tell whether your appendix is ready to burst? You know how they do that? They get their two fingers and they feel your abdomen. This is part of what it means to be a medical doctor. And this is being completely excluded from the gene pool now, because you can't test that with a number 2 lead pencil.
First of all, these kinds of specialized abilities, even indeed things like sport and darts and snooker and manual dexterity, it would be an example of manual dexterity to do that, correlates with IQ score at about 0.5.
I'm sorry. I just don't believe. I'm sorry. That's just too preposterous to believe. We'll reach an impasse here. We're judging. We're disagreeing on a matter of fact, and we can't go forward in a discussion like this if there's a disagreement of matter of fact. I've just given you an example.
I've given you an example of how that would be correlated with IQ. But anyway,
I've given you an example. I've given you an example of something
that is predicted by IQ. But anyway, 499. He does think it's preposterous. Okay, good. So, Willay says, "Why do you, Dr. Jones, think that people who grew up without fathers, is this to me or Dr. Jones, are less religious? I'd like an answer from both of you. Thank you." Okay, well, the reason I think that people that grow up, I'm not aware of direct evidence that people that grow up without fathers are less religious, but I wouldn't be at all surprised, because being religious is associated with sort of K strategy traits, and were you to grow up without a father, and your father would have and religious is about 40% genetic, and so were your fathers to have left your mother, I'd expect him to be less religious, and I'd expect you to have inherited that that trait. So that would be why. But I'm not aware of any evidence that people that grew up without fathers are necessarily less religious. Dr. Jones, do you have any view on this?
Yes, it's because God is an exalted father. That's what Sigmund Freud said. Sigmund Freud was an atheist. He hated religion, but it's true in a sense in which he found, in which he didn't. There was a profound truth that he was expressing that he didn't understand himself. He thought this was an argument for atheism. I'm saying it's an argument for the role that the father plays in the raising of a child. God is a father. God is an exalted father. If you have a father who is not dependable, if you have a father who abuses you, if you have a father who is cruel, any of these pathologies, you will have difficulty in believing in a benign God. It's that simple.
Why?
Because you get your idea from God, from your father. That's where it comes from. Obviously, this is a psychological explanation. Black people
in America tend to be more religious than white people, but they also tend to grow up without fathers.
Yes.
Yes. How does that fit with that?
The men are there. There's another issue here, which is homosexuality. Father deprivation leads to homosexuality.
How does it do that?
The paradox there is that in order to be absent, you have to be present. And what you have in the black family is absence and not presence. So this is a paradox in both the homosexuality and atheism. In order to be absent, you have to be present.
But levels of homosexuality are considerably lower among blacks than whites.
Pardon me?
Levels of homosexuality appear to be lower among black people than white people.
I know, I'm making the same argument here.
Also, homosexuals tend to be more likely to believe in God than heterosexuals.
Well, you could say that homosexuality is one response to father deprivation that precludes others. But I mean, I'm accepting your statistics. I don't know whether they're true or not, but I'm accepting them for the state of argument. Simply for the state of argument. What I'm trying to say in both instances is you have to be absent. You have to be present in order to be absent. So you have to be in the home. The son has to have access to you and perceive you as distant. If you're not there at all, he cannot perceive you as distant. You see what I'm saying?
Well, yes, but on the other hand, if you're not there at all, he can perceive you as very, very distant.
Say that again.
If you're not there at all, and all he sees is photographs of you and whatever, then he can perceive you as extremely distant indeed.
And there's an understanding. You understand why he's not there. He's dead, and that has problems of its own. There are problems without being fathers, but it's not the homosexual atheism.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right. I'll move on because there's a lot of people who want to ask you questions. Hypatia, $5 says, if the deity of Moses is real, why weren't the chosen people able to sink the USS Liberty, and why did God send the Black Plague on Christian Europe?
Would you read that again?
Why did God send the Black Plague on Christian Europe?
You're asking me to plumb the mind of God, which is something I cannot do. I cannot do. I can understand. I can understand God, the mind of God. I can understand that God exists simply by reason alone. I can understand the mind of God if God reveals that mind to me, as he did with the revelation of the Trinity. But for me to say that I can plumb the mind of God and understand every single possible, for example, every instance of evil in this world, what good came of it? That's something only God can do. Joseph could understand how evil took place in his life and how it was turned by good into God. We can all understand there is evil in our lives. In some instances, we can understand how that evil brought about some good. But for the most part, no, because to do that, you would have to have the mind of God, and I don't have the mind of God, so I can't answer that question.
Okay. She also asks, if the deity of Moses is real, why weren't the chosen people able to sink the USS Liberty?
First of all, the Jews the Israelis who launched the attack on the USS Liberty are not the children of Moses. They are not the children of Moses. The Catholic Church is the children of Moses because Jesus Christ was the Messiah that Moses looked forward to. So if you read the Gospel of St. John, you'll realize that the Jews today are not the children of Moses. I think that answers that question.
Okay. Then we have Liam Foley, €2. He says, don't forget to mention John Henry Newman. I'm going to have to go back to his earlier question here. Can Dr. Jones persuade Dr. Dutton to cross the Tiber to 3965 church, bracket, as Englishman John Henry Cardinal Newman, enemy of anti-logos liberalism, is raised to the altars? I really don't know what he means by this. Do you have much to say about Cardinal Newman?
Yes, he was a great thinker, a master of English prose, whose books used to be studied in English courses throughout the world. A man who was raised Anglican and suddenly realized that the Anglican Church could not be the Church of Christ, founded by Christ, and so he became a Catholic. Great thinker.
Yes, there was a lot of conversion of that kind among the English upper class at that time. You had the Tractarians. I did a biography of Churchill's prep school headmaster. He was called Herbert Snade Kinnersley, and he was Church of England, but he was a Tractarian. And they were considered to be the person that was the headmaster of Rugby, Thomas Arnold, said that he sees the Catholic as an enemy in his uniform, but he sees the Tractarian as an enemy disguised as a spy, i.e. because the Tractarian is within the Church of England, he's more dangerous. And he would have preferred it if people had just openly left and gone to the Catholic Church. Because they're within the Church of England, they're kind of like a fifth column.
Yes, this is the attitude that was created by the Reformation, which in England had no theological justification whatsoever. It was simply the theft of church property. So after the property was stolen, the people who had those ill-gotten goods had to create an ideology that would justify their theft, and that's what you're talking about here.
Well, they kind of developed the ideology first, but I think
sorry, the theft came first, and then the ideology.
The ideology is back to the Proto-Reformation in the 14th century.
There was no Reformation in the 14th century.
The Proto-Reformation, to John Wycliffe and people like that.
No, that has nothing to do with the Reformation. The Reformation was
similar ideas.
No, this is not about ideas. This is about theft. There is no continuity of ideas here whatsoever. There were no Englishmen proposing any theological ideas at the time of the Reformation. It was simply Henry VIII and the aristocrats lusting after church property. That's all it was. There was at least in Germany, there was a monk by the name of Luther who came up with some type of theological justification of the same thing in Germany, which was also theft. The Reformation was theft there as well. But there was nothing of this sort in England whatsoever.
Henry VIII divorced Catherine of Aragon in circa 1530. In the early 1500s, you had people, in the 1515, whatever, you had people being burnt at the stake in England, in Coventry, for Protestant heresy.
No, this was. Are you talking about Mary? Are you talking about? If you're talking about Bloody Mary, this is
accurate to say there was no Protestants in England before the divorce of Catherine of Aragon.
There were no. That's ipso facto the case because
I've just given you examples of people who were burned.
The Reformation.
There were people who were burned in Coventry in 1515 for advocating Lutheran or proto-Protestant, whatever ideas, for saying that.
Okay, well, that's Protestantism. Well, yeah, we know that there were people who were burnt at the stake because it was the tradition, the punishment for heresy at that time.
But the heresy they were accused of was saying that you could be saved by faith alone.
That's Luther.
Yes, and that's what they were accused of arguing, and that was both Luther's view and the view of the Proto-Reformation of the Lollards.
Started in Germany before it started in England. Okay,
yes,
and the only justification that the only theological justification the English had was what they got from Luther.
Have you heard of
Lollard? They brought that in to justify the theft of church
Okay.
property.
All right.
Are you disputing the fact? Are you disputing the fact that church property was stolen at
Oh,
this
no,
point?
no, not at all.
Good.
But my collapsed ancestor, Sir Piers Dutton, stole a great deal of church property. But
Good.
when he dissolved the monarchy,
We're talking about
are you
I'm saying all of the theological justification came after the fact of the theft,
Okay.
both in Germany and
are you
in
disputing?
England.
What's your view on the Lollards?
Low wages, the Black Plague causing labor shortage and wages not going up. I cover that book in Barren Metal.
But what were the Lollards advocating?
Higher wages.
No,
it ended completely. It ended completely with wage reform. You know, I like to bring something up here. I'm flattered that everyone thinks that I'm an expert on every possible topic under the sun. Okay, but it happens that I do write books about certain topics. And in many ways, it would be more productive if we focused on what I wrote.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I'm just debating the questions that we've got coming up. That's all. Right. So
I'm saying the whole notion of a super chat where people, I'm flattered by the fact that people want to ask me questions.
Oh, they do. I mean, they respect your opinion violently. These people, they respect your opinion a great deal. Right. So we go on to Craig Venter, the leader of the Genome Progressive Jew, 199. Willey, Edward, explain to Dr. Jones what Woodley's findings are regarding Calhoun's research shown, and ask how a Christian society would deal with mutants. Okay, are you familiar with this?
No.
So this is the idea that there was an experiment on mice in the 60s at the University of Maryland, and they basically took away evolutionary pressures from these mice. So no predators, nothing like that. And what happened was, first of all, there was a massive spike in population, lots and lots of them breeding, because of course none of them were being killed off as infants. Then the growth began to slow down. Then the population began to decline. And when it declined, you noticed strange things. You noticed that the men had to be pestered for sex. The women became highly masculine and attacked the young. And then you had this group called the beautiful ones, who were not interested in sex and were kind of this automaton autistic-likes who would just go around cleaning each other and grooming each other and doing nothing. And then eventually none of the mice had sex anymore and they all died out. And the collapse, the civilization completely collapsed. And it was suggested by my colleague Michael Woodley that this is what is happening to us. So the Industrial Revolution, spike in population slows down, then you get the rise of sexual deviancy and whatever. You get people in the West having fewer and fewer children, then the society collapses. And the question, the gentleman wonders if you have any thoughts on that from a religious perspective, that these mice are mutants and they have to be gotten rid of. Once you get rid of them, then the society gets normal again. From a Christian perspective, what should we do?
There's no such thing as deviancy among animals. Deviancy is as far as I can tell, a moral concept when you're talking about sexual behavior. The difference is that human beings, animals do not choose to have sex. Human beings do choose to have sex. So we're talking about two completely different mechanisms here. Okay,
we're talking about maladaptive behavior. So what seems to happen is that the population spikes up hugely, like it did with us. The population plateaus, like it did with us. The population starts to fall, like it did with us. And then you start to notice this maladaptive behavior. The idea is that the maladaptive behavior is influencing even the normal mice to do maladaptive things, and it causes this collapse. Get rid of the maladaptive genetic mutants, the society goes back to normal. So what should a Christian society do if this is happening to us?
Well, maladaption, from a Christian point of view, would be immoral behavior, wouldn't it? And when it comes to sex,
yeah.
So the point here is there is a logos to sexual behavior. Let's put it that way. That means that you can't exclude the unitive aspect from the you can't exclude the unitive and the procreative. You can't separate the unitive and the procreative. If you do, then you're going to have bad consequences. So what we saw over this period of time among the upper classes, especially in the English-speaking world, is that they started to use contraception. Now, if what you're claiming is that the upper classes are more intelligent than the lower classes. I think you said that in one of your talks, because income is a sign of intelligence. Why did they engage in massively unproductive, unintelligent behavior? Because as soon as they started using contraception, they eliminated intelligence from the gene pool, and they started making the culture stupid. I think there is evidence that we've become more stupid, more crude over this period of time.
Yes.
But my explanation is it's not genetic. It's moral. Because the educated classes, now, why did the Lambeth Conference in England in 1929 say that it was suddenly okay to use contraception? Was that genetic or was it moral? I would say it's moral.
Okay. Please don't send any more super chats because we only have 10 minutes and Dr. Jones has to go in 10 minutes. Right. Kerryman86 says, Dr. Jones, can you discuss the Jewish role in 17th century Poland, the expansion of the Jewish empire, the contempt the Jews had for the peasantry, the Cossack uprising, and the parallel with America?
Yes, I cover this in the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. The Polish Empire expanded eastward. It became the biggest country in Europe at this time, and it included the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population at this time. Once the Polish Empire expanded eastward, the Jewish business interests expanded with it, and they started cheating the Cossacks. And one of them, Cossacks who got cheated out of property and a wife, apparently, according to Heinrich Graetz, was the man by the name of Chmielnicki, who created what is known as the Chmielnicki pogroms, which is basically an uprising against Jewish hegemony in the Pale of the Settlement, slaughtered a lot of Jews. The Poles defended the Jews, but it became the beginning of the end of the Polish Empire, to the point where it disappeared completely within a century with the partition of Poland. So if you're saying, are there parallels with the United States? Yes, there are parallels. There are parallels with North America and the United States. When the British took over New France, they brought in Jewish traders to run their trading posts. The Jews cheated the Indians. The Indians rose up and slaughtered all of the English at Fort Michilimackinac. That was under New France. In the United States of America, you saw the rise of Jewish political influence, largely through illegal means like usury and gambling, which then became legal because of Jewish influence, expanded over the political realm and causing the same type of disruption when the Jews get behind their form of moral crusades, in other words, like promoting abortion or pornography, wars in the Middle East. All of these things are a direct result of the increased Jewish influence. So yes, I can see parallels.
Okay. Another question is Aleph the Nemesis says, thoughts on Mark Brahmin's fight. Are you familiar with Mark Brahmin?
No.
I'll leave that then. I'll do that later. Right. And then we have Chris. What do you think of Julius Evolar's works on traditionalism?
Don't know enough to have an opinion.
Okay. Well, Julius Evolar, yeah. I mean, I think you might find something in common with him. James Conway says IQ correlates with busybody intelligence and nothing else. Okay, well, I've demonstrated in detail that that's not true, but fine. John Oliver Allen Rayner Hills Esquire, this has to be the last question, says, what's Jones's theory of what spreads atheism? He has two questions. Let's do that first. Why do you think atheism spreads, Dr. Jones?
Psychologically, it's weak fathers. I've said that already.
Weak fathers, okay. Do you accept
on a larger scale? Atheism began to spread because of the spread of materialism, which began with the death of Hegel in 1831. So, at a certain point, German idealism had overreached. The main man involved here was Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote his book, The Essence of Christianity. He wrote a letter to Hegel in 1828 in which he said, I am basically carrying your Hegel's position, proposition to its logical conclusion, which is if the dialectic is the basis of God's existence, then we don't need God. All we need is the dialectic. And someone who thought that was a great idea was Karl Marx, who then transposed the dialectic into a political movement. And these were the forces that created atheism from the 19th century up to our day.
You know, one of the things that predicts atheism is having an old father.
This is what I said before.
Father.
If you see, he has to be present. If he's present and weak, or present and tyrannical, present and absent at the same time, that is the psychological breeding ground for atheism.
The mediator seems to be autism. Old fathers produce children that are more autistic, and autistics are less likely to believe in God. Anyway, he also says, do you accept divine simplicity?
Do you mean it's God simple?
I don't know what he means by that. Okay, and then he finally says,
there can be no parts in God, if that's what you're referring to. There can only be unity. There can be no parts to God. Okay.
Okay, and finally he says, do you have an opinion of William Lane Craig and similar people?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I don't think we have any other questions, but I do find it absolutely fascinating that, as perhaps became clear from the discussion here, that Dr. Jones and myself clearly disagree animatedly on quite a few things, but yet perhaps we do agree in this concept of the truth and the need for the truth in debate, which I think is very, very important, and not this idea the left have that it's okay to suppress the truth if you feel like it.
Right.
So, Dr. Jones, do you have anything else to add? Are there any? What's your latest book that you're? What's your?
I'm working on the book, the history of Logos and the Logos of history, which is the development of that idea of Logos, that there's an order to the universe, and how that idea has developed over the course of history.
And do you mind my asking, are you a convert to Catholicism, or were you raised?
I was raised Catholic.
And was there any point where you've had a kind of a Logos?
Yeah, there was a period of apostasy when I was a late teenager. It ended when I went to Germany in 1973. Got a job teaching there, and I came back to the faith in 1973, and I've never changed my mind since that time.
And you were how old, if you don't mind asking, in 73? What, your early 20s?
I was 25 years old in 1973.
So what was it that happened in 73, if you don't mind asking, that changed things?
There was a German guy. I ended up playing in a band with him. He was my tutor in German. He said, brought a book in. It was the only book in English in the library. The sisters had to clear out their library. And it was the only book in English. He said, here's a book in English. Maybe you might want to read it. And it was Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. And I read it, and I converted back to Catholicism as a result of reading it.
What was it about that book that was so powerful for you?
Well, it was basically Merton's autobiography. And he aspired to be a literary man. And at that point, I aspired to be a literary man, too. And I thought, well, if he can't do it, I mean, he said that there was something higher to that, and that I gave up my idea of being a literary man because I finally understood what God was. The irony, of course, is that I ended up being a literary man because that was God's plan for my life from the beginning. So there was a certain amount of irony in there, but it had to do with having written a novel, having failed to publish the novel, having basically just given up on that part of my life. I thought, okay, I'll just accept whatever comes. And that's a better attitude to have. It's better to accept whatever comes than to live according to an illusion. It turns out that the illusion was what I was supposed to do anyway, but I had to find that out in a different way.
Right. And it sort of, and it flipped things over. And then subsequent to that, you were a university lecturer. Is that right?
I got a PhD in American Literature from Temple University. I then got a job as an assistant professor at St. Mary's College in South Bend, Indiana, which is why I'm here. I was fired 1 year after I arrived there because I was against abortion. There was a certain irony here because it was a Catholic college that fired me because I was against abortion. This is an example, I would say, of one of the bad things that happened to me that turned out to be a good thing, because now I realize the best thing that ever happened to me was getting kicked out of academia. I got kicked out 40 years ago, okay, before it got as horrible as it is today. It's the only thing that allowed me to go on and do what I really wanted to do, which is to be a writer, which is what I am today.
Excellent. All right. Well, I don't think there's anything. So I shall answer the super chats which you were not able to. And thank you very much for coming on the show. And as I say, a lot of my viewers were very enthusiastic about hearing what you had to say. You seem to have developed a kind of cult following in recent years. Is that fair?
Well, I hope, I don't know whether I have a cult following or not, but I mean, I hope we had, I hope I answered the questions. I'm not sure. I don't think, I still think that we need work before we have a meeting of the minds, but I'm glad we had a chance to talk to each other.
Yeah, it was very nice to talk to you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Do click out then, because I'm going to stay on. All right.
Okay.
Bye. Okay, so turning to the super chats, which Dr. Jones didn't do, or didn't feel able to answer. First of all, we have thoughts about Mark Brahmin's findings that Apollo's followers were a eugenics cult in Greece, Rome, and Rachel was Aryan, Leah was prototypically Jewish. Mark Brahmin is someone who I've only come across relatively recently. And I'm quite interested in a key idea that he has, which is that he's kind of saying that with European with Christianity, there's almost a uniqueness in the sense that what do myths do? Myths are there to help us to think through the nature of life, help us to make sense of life, help us to project ourselves onto this kind of metaphysical reality where we have these figures and they engage in things and we do what they do or whatever. And one of the unique things about Christianity is that that set of myths relate to a ethnic group that is not ours. With Islam, it's a bit different because although Islam, to a certain degree, develops from Christianity, it's influenced by Christianity. Of course, Muhammad was heavily influenced by Christianity. It brings in Muhammad and it brings in his followers and a new series of saints and people like this. And these people are of course Arab. They're not of that race. Now, Christianity does bring in saints who are not Jewish, so there's that element to it. But the fundamental myths and whatever are all based around a different ethnic group, which is quite interesting. So the whole concept, it could be, Brahmin seems to argue, of thinking about good and evil relates to a different ethnic group, which is an interesting idea. The idea that Apollo's followers were a eugenics cult is not something that I am familiar with. I'd have to look into that more, although I wouldn't be at all surprised if you could argue that the whole nature of the Roman cult was highly eugenic for various reasons. And I'm looking at this at the moment. It was taking these ideas, which were religious, which were adaptive ideas, and making them the will of the gods. So I have every reason to suspect that it may well be. Rachel was Aryan. Don't know. Okay, so that's all I can say about that. What do I think of Julius Evolus's works on traditionalism? This is a difficult question, really. I don't find him an easy read, and I like my books to be easily digestible, simply written, nicely written. I like D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence philosophizes about certain things, and it's well written, and it's crisply written, and it's a good read. I mean, of course, it depends on the quality of the translation, but it strikes me that to the extent that translations of Nietzsche are faithful to his style, he was obviously a good read. His writing was good. He was well written. Whereas someone like Schopenhauer, it's a very boring read, assuming it's faithful to his style. It's not well written. And I find Julius Evolus's whole style to remind me of kind of postmodernism, really, postmodern writing, complicated, difficult, verbose kind of a read. I don't know what it's like in the original Italian, but in the translations I've read. And so I do find his works rather impenetrable and opaque. From what I've heard of summaries of his work, then yeah, he seems to, the fundamental point that seems to be sensible to me is that once you say that you believe in truth and you believe in the pursuit of truth, then it can be argued there has to be some sort of validation external validation to truth. And so you end up potentially in a situation where you have to accept that there is some sort of metaphysical reality. He and Guénon and people like that also argue that it's better if you're part of a religious community and it has some deep connection to history and it has some sort of mysterious element and all this kind of thing. And that certainly seems to be true from the research that we have, that people that are involved in those kinds of organizations are happier. So in that sense, I would be cautiously positive about him. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up here. So I hope this was of interest. As I emphasized to you, it seemed to me that myself and Dr. Jones did not have a great deal in common, and I very much disagree with him about many things that he said. I think the Lollards were definitely a proto-Protestant, and this is normally accepted. I gave examples of why IQ tests correlate with things other than IQ tests, so I don't agree with him. People say we need to sort out a moderator team. Well, you know, if people could just say, "I was triggered," was I triggered? Says Me Too. I don't know if I was triggered. I was kind of amazed that somebody could just dismiss me stating here's the historical evidence. This is the case. Here's the data. This could be just dismissed. I found this very, very odd. So I suppose I got slightly yes. I've been spammed with porn links. Okay, well I can delete those later. It's not a problem. You just go to hide. Right, so I've got a super chat here from 123 Red Dawn. You should have a chat with Dr. John David Ebert. Okay, am I going to find this person to be similar to? Well, I can delete the porn links. There's no problem. I simply go through this and delete the porn, any links there that are bad, and I can delete them. And anything that's problematic in any way, I can simply go through and delete. So I see no issue there. Aunt Bessie's Yorkshire pudding, 79p. Thank you very much. So yes, so I think that's pretty much it. Be more proactive than that. I'll offer to help moderate the chat. Fine, TT, I will put you down as moderator of the chat if that's what you're offering to do. That suits me. Ed, you should have told EMG that facts don't care about his feelings. Well, I suppose he was on there, and I had to be aware that there were lots and lots of people that seemed to think that he's the cat's pajamas, and so I wasn't really sure quite how to react. But yes, I don't. He doesn't seem to be too au fait with certain facts on issues, and I was quite surprised as a person who is a Catholic theologian that he had no understanding of the Proto-Reformation to the extent that he didn't think it existed. I can't see how anyone can possibly think that the Proto-Reformation didn't exist. The Proto-Reformation did exist. We've got detailed evidence for this, and they were burning Lollards at the stake before the Reformation. So I see no issue there. IQ does not determine intelligence, says Joseph Neal. No, it doesn't. No, obviously not. No, nobody thought it did. How can IQ determine intelligence? IQ is intelligence quotient. It is your intelligence in relation to people of your own age. It doesn't determine intelligence. How could it? Did not understand the science of statements. No, well, he didn't understand the science of statements. He should have done. Can't go back and watch. Yes, okay. So the people obviously that are going to write anything that's remotely annoying will simply be removed permanently from the channel and unable to do anything again. But anyway, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and I shall put out a video later this week. And I'll have to yes. And so I hope this was of interest. I hope this was sufficiently black-pilled and based and all those other things that people seem to be interested in. I shall be off now, and have a good evening and goodbye.